All right, today we're getting into probably the biggest news story of the year so far, which is tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. That's what everyone is talking about. Trump's tariffs, the backlash against them, the effect it's been having in the last couple of weeks. And we're also going to cover a major tariff announcement that came just yesterday. So stick around. I love that intro music. All right, so I want to set the stage for a little bit. So the first thing I want to do, I just want to recognize that there is a lot of fear and concern around Trump's tariffs, and I would say a lot of legitimate fear and concern around the tariffs. I have an understanding of why there's been a lot of kind of fear and a lot of shaking, a lot of sort of panicky headlines. And so we're going to get into, I'd say, like the good of the tariffs, the bad of the tariffs, the ugly, and I would say the hopeful of the tariffs today. And so we're going to cover it from all angles. But one of the reasons, of course, that people have been freaking out was we had a major drop in the stock market, probably caused by, the market sort of freaking out about potential for reciprocal tariffs, countries threatening tariffs on top of our tariffs, on top of the tariffs that they already had. But we'll get into that. And I just want to say from the start that I'm not somebody that just jumps on the Trump train and just supports anything that Trump is doing. The first time around, Trump's first presidential time in office, he did some tariffs, and I was pretty much against those. I was very skeptical of those. This time around, I've also been very skeptical of the tariffs. However, I will say in the last couple months, I've been doing a lot of research, and there's been a lot of things moving. And there's been some signs, even in this past week, that have kind of changed my mind a little bit. I'm actually more confidently in favor of what Trump has done with the tariffs today, probably than I've ever been before. So we're going to get into some of those reasons, but we're still going to address the serious concerns that people have. So Troy, let's pull up that stock market graph, and let's just start by looking at the stock market, looking what it's done, because this is a big reason why there's been concern in the last couple of weeks. And so you see the top line there, that is the stocks for the last month. And then I went ahead and threw up the stocks for the last year and the stocks for the last 5 years, just for some context, because the stock market can look really scary when it starts to go down really fast. So you see on the top line right there around April 2nd, of course, that's when most of the tariffs went into effect just a week ago, just a little more than a week ago. It's been a long last couple of weeks. And we had a major drop in the stock market. I think my math was like 12% or something like that, 12% sudden drop in the stock market. And then there's a little bit of recovery and then dropped again. And then just yesterday, Trump made an announcement that caused the stock market to hop back up. But I just wanted to highlight for people that get really freaked out about the stock market, or people that are threatened or feel like they need a panic sell. If you take a look at like the last year, you can see even with the drop off, it was only a little bit lower than it was a year ago, and it's already recovered and gone back to where it was a year ago. And then if you look at the last 5 years, the drop is nothing. Like that the very edge of that on the bottom one, that like 12% drop is still significantly higher than we were 5 years ago. So the stock market's kind of a funny thing. It's people can feel threatened to like, we need to like sell our stocks because the stock market's about to crash or something like that. But most of the times, even these sudden drops, if you just wait it out, they recover. And so that's just a little tiny, amateur stock market analysis kind of going on there. But I like to look at the larger graphs. That way, you have some context for what's actually happening. I think it's just worth noting. So let's start getting into, thanks for the graph, Troy, you can throw it away. But let's just start getting into, what's happened in the last couple of weeks. We'll get into, of course, what happened yesterday. So what do you guys think what's the point of these tariffs? What is the administration's ultimate goal for these tariffs? Why has there been so much, noise and freak out and panic headlines about the tariffs? And, how's other countries responded to it? So let's maybe just start with the first question. What is the goal of the tariffs? That's the way that you guys see it.
So the way I see this is the goal of the tariffs is to basically just reshape the entire global trade market. And we saw since, the 40s or something, the Bretton Woods system is what was in place. And that was fixing currencies to the dollar. and hosting U.S. military and having access to U.S. markets and that sort of thing. And so that's really overvalued the dollar, and everybody has the reserve currencies for the dollar. But now, then the dollar came off the gold standard. And the thing is, that's great to help other countries grow. But the thing is, then it's hard to have an industrial base in the U.S. And so I think this is about bringing an industrial base back, and you have to have some turbulence. It's sort of this way to bring back the sovereignty of the U.S., the leverage, use the leverage of the U.S., and sort of get back into where we can have, this is actually a national security interest now. And so you have to weaken other currencies. And we can talk about how this is actually worked out per the design of a paper that came out from the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for Trump. And that's actually, they gave a roadmap, and what we're seeing in the market is exactly what's playing out. That's the financial market consequences. There's significant trade changes. There's financial policy changes. All of these things were mentioned in there, and they're now coming to fruition just a few months into this. And so I think that the real goal is to really reshape everything. And it's kind of tough because you have a strong dollar, which is really good for imports, but it's tough for exports. And so now we're trying to balance keeping the dollar as the reserve currency of the world, and at the same time having a strong industrial base. And so instead of benefiting the financial elites, we could benefit the middle of America and actually our manufacturing and industrial base. So for me, that's the entire design of this. You had to have a little bit of chaos, and what we saw in the markets is a normal response. You have a difference between fundamentals and sentiment. Sentiment is more short term, where the fundamentals are all in place, and sentiment, where people don't know exactly what's going to happen just short term. And that's where you start to see some of the sell-offs. And then you even see other industrial sell-offs or industrial traders, commercial trade, because of just they're getting ready to pick up the dip and bring it back up. And so there's just some of that normal trade flow,
which is exactly what
so for me, yeah, this is all a coordinated chaos, I guess you could say. There.
It does look to be exactly what happened. Doug, I want you to hop in, but real fast, our producer is telling me I need to tell people that this was not my analysis of the stock market is not financial advice. So nobody take my analysis as what you should be.
None of us are financial advisors.
We're not financial advisors. So don't take this as financial advice. I'm not giving you financial advice. I was just making observations about what the stock
market. We're not going to let everybody know that we all made millions in the stock market this week. I'm obviously being facetious.
Trump texted me and he told me to buy. Now's a good time to buy. Did you guys get that text?
Did you forward that text, Doug? You could have forwarded a little faster.
He texted
he really did,
world,
didn't he?
Actually.
Yeah, that is interesting. Are you going to jump in on that, Doug?
Well, that I think that plays into the bigger conversation about market manipulation. And I think that there's an element of insider trading, and then there's an element of just paying attention. And if you were paying attention, the result of this was going to be obvious. Whenever the market does something extreme, it's going to correct. So unless you really literally think that the world is ending, then it's going to go back to what it was generally, give or take. You know what I mean? Like, and this is consistent. It's historical, especially with the stock market. The history repeats itself. You can see exactly what it's going to do. You can project out. And I mean, you might not be able to hit every high and low exactly when you want to hit it or predict them whenever they're going to come out, but they're coming. And I like how you pointed out earlier, Reese, when we had the graph up, the big saying is zoom out. Whenever you start panicking about the stock market or crypto, which is where my brain always goes, the best advice is zoom out and take another look, take a deep breath, and recognize that this is just temporary. Calm down. It's going to correct. I think to answer your question, though, Reese, another part of what's happening with the tariffs and the trade war and all that, and the reconfiguration of things like what you were saying, Ryan, which I totally agree with. There's another element of this that is a sort of covert, clandestine mission to enter crypto into the world market. And I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work, but I think that is going to play a part in this manipulation, because it is a manipulation, but it's not a secret manipulation. We can see it happening if you're just paying attention.
And I think I was just say real quick clarification for anybody who, when hears us say crypto, it is not the same thing as a central bank digital currency. That's digital currency that they can control the supply. That's not the same thing as decentralized cryptocurrencies. So okay, Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually
Go ahead,
digital.
Troy.
assets.
Back to you.
Yeah, I want to look at some numbers because I think y'all are bringing up some interesting points. So this is, well, that's the wrong graph. There we go. I almost talked about China. We're not allowed to talk about China yet. This is the share of adults in U.S. middle class and how it's decreased considerably since 1971. So if you look at that graph, there's 1971, there's 2021 above it. So lower income was 25%, now it's 29%. Middle income was 61%, now it's 50%. That's a huge drop. Upper income 14 to 21%. So we've seen an increase, a growth in the lower income and the upper income. And obviously these numbers are, they're being adjusted to take inflation into account. And the just the different numbers across the board. But
this is
the
people
middle
who are
income,
investing. Is that what? Am I understanding that correctly?
No, he's talking about people that are considered to be in the middle class.
I'm talking about income in general in the United States.
Oh, in general. Okay.
61% in 1971 were considered middle class. 50% now are considered middle class or middle income, right? And obviously there's a lot of different variations of this chart. But the point being that we don't have the same jobs that we used to have. So let me pull this up right here. Manufacturing has been falling as a share of employment for decades, but its decline is in absolute terms began more recently. So this is the share of all jobs right here. This is the millions of manufacturing jobs right here. So we actually see this is again back to 1970. We see that it kind of stayed pretty steady, and then right in 2000 is when it really began to drop off. And then right there at 2008, it took a huge dip, and obviously that was in response to the recession and the crash and everything. And businesses started saying, well, how are we going to keep our margins high? And so there was a huge pull out of the United States, and then there's a little bit of a spring back here. Now I want to pull up if I have it. Well, no, I might not have it here. No, I don't have that other. Yeah, sorry, I don't have the other graph. But here's I just want to bring up some actual information, some actual stats, because I really feel like this is part of the problem. So blue collar jobs, and this is looking at the real national economy. So we can look at the stock market and what's happening there, right? And historically, Trump has had his eye on the stock market. He's not a president that's ignored the market. And I think that's part of the reason why, because of the dip that he said, okay, now we're going to do the 90-day, pause on these tariffs. I think it's because he's paying attention to the stock market even more than that, probably paying attention to the bonds market. But this is 1979. There were 25 million blue collar jobs available in 1979. 2022, there's 12.97 million blue collar jobs available.
Dang.
There should be a lot more because the population has boomed, right? There's a lot less. There's almost half. And in 2010, we saw, because of the exploding trade deficit and the recession from 2008, we saw a huge drop off, and then they came back by 2017, and then by 2022, and now we've seen them drop off once more, probably because of COVID, and everything happening there. And so there's this idea of if anyone's ever watched like Shark Tank or something like that, which is like one of my go-tos. There's this idea of if you want to go from being like a small business, like a $1 to $2 million business, to a $20 million business, you're going to have to cut your margins. Like you're going to have to grow those profit margins, and you're going to have to cut the expense margins, right? And one of the ways that people have historically done that over the last 50 years in the United States is to send manufacturing overseas. And so we've seen this huge loss in just the availability of blue collar jobs in the United States. Now, there's a lot of other factors playing into that. One of those factors being that the average American opinion of a blue collar job has changed, and what do I want to get out of life? And I think Disney movies have maybe like played into that a little bit.
I think media influence for sure, because everybody feels like they have to be the richest person on earth because of watching too much TV.
Right. And here's the crazy thing, Doug. This is my opinion. This is my personal opinion now. I think we've unfortunately landed ourselves in a pit as Americans where we would rather take a salary cut and have a fancy job where I sit behind a desk or manage somebody than just work hard, outside and make twice as much money. There's this idea of like it's almost like a shame or a stigma when it comes to actual work, and working hard and getting my hands dirty. You're like, oh, well, you work that kind of job. And I honestly believe that some of the things that are happening now with the tariffs are addressing this issue of we need to bring manufacturing back to the United States because we don't have the jobs available we used to have. And not only that, but I think there's an even deeper underlying issue here where the public opinion, unfortunately, needs to change when it comes to blue collar jobs in the United States. So there's my 2 cents.
Yeah. I just want to hit on that real fast. I think that, as Doug was saying, I think a lot of that public opinion has kind of been top down because with the emergence of like NAFTA and a lot of the free trade, and then we'll get into China later, but like letting China into the World Trade Organization, there's been this idea essentially where the United States, this was the idea, you know, at the turn of the 90s, was like the United States is going to shift to being purely a information and consumer economy. So like we are putting out into the world no longer physical goods, we are putting out information. We're putting out like desk jobs where we're smart and, you know, and we're preaching to the choir right now. I'm like talking to poor talking heads right now. I don't do any work outside, so just saying. So it's kind of funny, but that's essentially the shift. Is like, well, we want our economy to be where we are. It's just about like information essentially, and then everything that needs to be made, somebody else in a different country can make it for us, and we'll just buy it on entirely consumer economy because we need to be buying lots and lots of cheap goods that are being made in other countries in order for that to work. And it was just a massive shift. And I think Ryan brought it up, was like what we're seeing right now is like a reconfigure, some sort of like attempt to shift back to a healthier form of economy that should work for more of the average Joe essentially. But I'm sure you want to hop in on that, Ryan.
Well, yeah, it needs to be balanced because, I mean, I've worked 20 years in manufacturing and supply chain, like global supply chains and manufacturing, and how things have changed over the world. And you can't just snap your fingers and all of a sudden have a manufacturing plant and a new supply chain in a new part of the world. But the thing is, here I mentioned the Bretton Woods system where everything was pegged to, gold was pegged to the or dollar pegged to gold, and all the other currencies pretty much pegged to the dollar. And that created the dollar as the reserve currency around the world. I used to trade currencies, and you look at the fundamentals of a country, and the U.S. has a lot of debt. And the only reason, fundamentally, it should not be a strong currency, but it's strong because like 60-70% of the transactions around the world involve the dollar, and it's the reserve currency. And so it's actually overvalued. And what that means is it makes it very expensive to manufacture goods here. But the problem is now we have, or in the U.S., I mean, and the problem is though, is that then you have national security issues where you have all these critical supply chains that are now they can just be shut off. And we saw this during 2020 and some of the different critical things. And so that's something that this is attempting to do, is to bring it back into balance. And that's the explicit goal of, I mentioned this paper that was mentioned. And so the thing is, you have to also weaken other countries' currencies. And we're actually seeing that. You mentioned China, we're going to talk about later, but we've seen that the renminbi is weakened. And so, and that's a highly manipulated currency. Everybody manipulates their currency, but that's a little bit different story. But they've actually allowed that. And so what we need to do is have a balance of keeping the reserve currency around the world as the dollar so that it stays strong, but then also having other currencies weaken and being able to bring the industrial base back. But that's a tough thing to balance. And that's why we're seeing this kind of shakeup here. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this works out. But I've even seen other reports of companies trying to come back, but they can't find people to do the jobs. And so this gets into the cultural thing that you're mentioning. And like in China, you can have 300,000 people work in one factory. In the US, like you're going to try to find 1,000 people to work in one factory. That's going to take some time.
Right. And that's one of the things I did some research on. What are the pros and cons of overseas manufacturing in 2025 right now? So advantages: lower labor costs, a large number of manufacturing partners, high volume capacity, proximity of suppliers of raw materials and components. And here's the number 5, plenty of skilled labor and talent. Plenty of skilled labor and talent. So this is what that article said. The availability of skilled manufacturing workers in foreign countries often exceeds what you can find in the U.S. At the start of 2022, the U.S. manufacturing industry had 859,000 open manufacturing jobs.
Wow.
So,
well,
part of the problem is we're not manufacturing. The other part of the problem is that people don't want to do the work. Like people don't want the jobs.
And
we're just not used to it. We don't know how. We're not educated.
Right.
That's not what we went to school to do.
Element.
Or they don't want to. The people that need the jobs don't want to live in the spaces where the jobs are available. Because that's another.
There's one other piece we got to put in here is, I worked in a union environment when I was operations management in a union environment, and that unions have a purpose, they serve a purpose, but sometimes they overdo the purpose, like what we see with the longshoremen on the ports and all that, where they want to stop automation, they want to stop advancement, they want to not have the ports open 24 hours a day. And so some of these could be alleviated by just completely opening up and letting automation come and all these kinds of things. And then your 4 jobs transition into your 4 hand jobs, like hand work jobs, transition into more computer programming jobs or maintenance jobs for the automation and those sorts of things, instead of the hand labor, but there's nothing wrong with that though either. I mean, I worked, like I said, with these different people in construction and manufacturing and all those sorts of things. And there are unsafe things that are in those jobs. And that's where you want automation to have a safer environment, to not have such a repetitive thing where you're doing the same thing over and over and over. And there's different technologies that we need to have to alleviate some of that.
Yeah.
Well,
absolutely.
right.
Go ahead and put your 2 cents in, Troy.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there's better ways to do the jobs. I think the main point being, I watched a video from Charlie Kirk this week, and I don't know, Reese, if you're going to talk about that or not. But what he said was the title of the video was "We have been lied to about what's going on with the stock market." So if you follow Charlie Kirk, you probably saw it because that video exploded and it's been doing really well. But one of the points he made was the last 5 years, the stock market has been doing great. Wall Street's been doing great. The working class has not, because there's these 2 versions of the American economy. There's essentially the wealthy stock market version, where it's like I believe it's 8% of the wealthiest Americans own 93% of stocks.
Sounds about right.
Right. But I mean, that is, I will to be fair, 60% of Americans own at least some stock. So
right.
Almost like over half of Americans are affected when the stock market goes down, but to an extent. But
mostly the people that are affected the most are the 8% that own most.
The 8%, the wealthiest. Yes, they are the ones that technically lose the most money.
And guess what they're doing?
Biggest percentage.
They're buying.
Well, yeah, exactly. So that's the thing. They stand to lose the most money, but you're right. They know what they're doing and probably buying at the right time. But there's another version of the economy, which is like the real economy, which is like, hey, I'm making a median income in the United States, and I've got a couple kids, and I'm trying to. This is not me, obviously, but as an example, I'm just trying to buy milk and eggs and pay my rent on time. And so there's another version of the economy that affects most Americans, and most Americans can relate to in one way or another. Whether that's I'm having a hard time buying milk and eggs, or whether I'm having a hard time just paying off my student loan debt or whatever it is. And so that's the version of the economy that some of these things I believe are going to affect in the long term. That's been needed to be corrected for a long time, and we have needed a reset.
Absolutely. What you're talking about, if I could hop in on it, is what people call a difference between the Wall Street economy and the Main Street economy, which I think is a really helpful name. It doesn't completely cover everything that we're talking about, but it's a helpful frame up. If you have Wall Street economy and Main Street economy, I actually want to highlight a comment that we got here. Can I show this? JM said inflation adjusted, if I remember right, is based on CPI value or basket of goods. It doesn't directly include things like the cost of housing. It's almost unaffordable for many current households. And that's exactly what you just said, Troy. It was essentially the stock market has been doing very well the last 5 years. And I don't know, I didn't look into the CPI value in the basket of goods.
And you have to
know what they're referring to. But the stock market's been doing really great for the last 5 years. But housing is almost unaffordable in the United States. And so if we're talking about, people saying, well, this is, Trump's tariffs, people have been running around and screaming, especially people that want. And here's part, and I know we hinted at this a little bit, but as I brought up, there are legitimate fears and concerns and gambles for raising tariffs, but also there's been, I say a concerted effort to raise the panic levels and to make it, and also to blur the messaging, because you have the messaging coming out of the White House saying, hey, this is why we're doing the tariffs. We're trying to get countries to negotiate with us. We're doing this, we're doing that. Ryan mentioned about having a plan. There's actually a real plan in place for what they're doing. But a lot of the media and a lot of people that really want Trump to fail and really want to have new leadership in office the next time around, they want to paint this, because this is Trump's biggest thing, is tariffs. So they are trying everything they can to paint this as chaos, as absolute mass chaos. And the funny thing about the stock market is it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you have enough people saying this is going to be really, really bad, it makes people panic sell, and then it makes the prices go down. So if you have enough people who believe the market is going to do bad, then I think that's part of the reason. Obviously, there was going to be an adjustment. There was going to be a drop, but I think that's part of the reason why there was such an intense drop is because there's been a concerted effort to make it seem like he's just doing chaos for chaos sake. Well, but back to just that point, though, like the Main Street versus the Wall Street economy, there's a lot of Wall Street kind of economist looking people that are like, oh, no, these tariffs are going to be bad because, oh, look at like there's a little drop in the stock market. But then you have the Main Street, the average Joe here in the United States being like, our economy is doing worse than it's ever been before. I cannot buy a house. I cannot feed my family. Like the most basic things that need to be corrected and need to be sorted out. Like that is, from my understanding, that's part of what a lot of the tariffs and the renegotiation of these trade deals is kind of about. So,
yeah.
So there's a couple of things I wanted to mention. I think so. Like I'm glad he mentioned the CPI number. There's other numbers that you measure economy by, and for like Forex trading or currency trading, like new housing starts, or like that's the other piece of what he was talking about there. And so I think it's interesting though, because when you see these big,
we're losing you,
which
Ryan.
is like what I'm doing with my little account, and then you have like broker trades. How about now?
Yeah, you're good. Keep going.
My back. Okay.
You're good.
So you have retail traders like me, who's just doing smaller accounts. And you have brokers who are doing these huge, massive accounts. And then you would have the FOMC or the Federal Open Market Committee come out with an announcement or a CPI, or they're going to do print some more dollars or whatever it's going to be. And then you see the market just shoot one way. And that's because everybody knows this is what happens when that announcement comes. And so then the market goes down, and then what? All the brokers and retail traders and everything buy the market back up to exactly where it was. And so that's where you get into technical analysis, and you combine that with your sentiment and with the fundamentals, underlying fundamentals. And then you actually put like Fibonacci sequences and things on the charts, and you see these ceilings and floors. And I mean, it's all bouncing in between these things, and it's all very predictable. And so there's high probabilities. And so some of that, I think, is what's happening here. I do think some of it is just because there is actually uncertainty, because they don't know exactly what's going to happen. But it is not 100% uncertainty. It's sort of like uncertainty within a bandwidth. So it's kind of like it could happen, but it's going to be within this range. And if anything outside of that, like China, we're going to talk about. But everybody else is responding exactly in line with what was anticipated. And to me, it happened faster than I would have expected. It's only been a few months, and we're seeing it play out exactly as this November 2024 paper said it would from the Central Economic Advisors. And so I think it's good news. It's going to be interesting to see what we get into here with China. But yeah, I think it's going the right direction.
I threw this graphic up because this is a screenshot from a live stream White House press briefing this week on Tuesday. And they just brought up some interesting stats. So the first thing they said was 228,000 jobs have been added by employers just in March. And that's the fourth highest month in private payroll growth in the past 2 years. And then also Trump has already secured, and you see this stat there on the screen, altogether over $5 trillion in investments secured from foreign governments added to the private sector investments. Private sector investments, he's secured over 1.5 trillion, which is actually $500 billion more than Biden secured during his entire term. So there's a lot of other ways to look at what's happening to the economy right now. And if we look at some of the positive numbers where we say, okay, there's actually there's a lot of belief around the globe in not specifically what Trump is doing, but I believe in America in general and the strength of the dollar still, even though, there's a lot of pushback against the strength of the dollar, but the strength of the American economy, the strength of America in general, and the market here in America. So I think there's this idea of, and obviously we're going to get into maybe China versus the United States in a little bit, but there's this idea that it was a gamble, and it's true. Trump is taking risks, absolutely, but by doing the whole tariff thing. But I think he's betting on some things that still are very strong when it comes to sentiment about the United States. And obviously, I mean, we see that with just, out of 20 countries that were given tariffs, we see immediately 17 of them said, okay, we're going to come to the table and
Yeah.
We're going to negotiate. And only 3 of them even tried to push back against it. So, you know, there's this idea that he's moving with a lot of force behind him. And I think we see that working.
Yeah, and I think that also with the conversations happening with these other countries on the tariffs, it is my personal opinion that these conversations already happened and Trump already knew, and the whole administration, they all already knew these things were going to happen. Like, they've already made these agreements and we're just now finding out about it. It would be, I can't imagine that with how interconnected all of the governments in the world are, that any of this is coming as a surprise to any of them. I think that they all are very well aware of what's going to happen and how they're going to respond to it. And they know they have enough of a relationship with each other that they just know what they're going to do. And so
except for the fact that
I have secure, because he's like, I know what's going to happen. I've been told.
I would push back on that a little bit just because Trump, maybe that happens more often, but Trump is so into the whole shock factor thing that I think he's literally letting people know about stuff on Truth Social.
It's not necessarily that it's a direct
this is
communication. I think it's just more like they know each other well enough. They know what they're going to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they're not pulling the wool over the eyes. Like, they know where it's going to have to go. And I think like Trump is doing, he's bringing in media and leveraging all of that with his background to get leverage in this sort of thing. And I think, you know, it's important. A couple of points. I think you had a graph or a picture of Trump holding up showing that this is bringing reciprocal for what everybody else is doing. This is actually bringing back to fair trade because everybody else has been taking advantage of the U.S. And I have an example.
Okay if I pull that graph up?
Yeah.
You can pull it up. You can pull up the picture of Nancy Pelosi. Yeah, go for it.
But I had an example of this. So this is where he's showing, look, all we're doing is bringing this in line. This is what this is what other countries have been doing to the U.S. And this is what we're doing with each of these other countries. And guess what? That's why they quickly say, oh, okay, here, let's come 0-0. We're done taking advantage of you. We'll do what you want. And we need to be fair. And that is why that was allowed after the World War, because the U.S. said, okay, we'll go ahead and be the reserve currency and we'll go ahead and overvalue our currency and everybody else. And then we bring the world economy back. But now it's far past the time to bring things back to the way they should be with a better balance. And so that's what we're talking about here. But I have an example of sort of what the point you're making, Doug. So I was working in the U.S., working for a large multinational corporation and buying parts for factories in the U.S., but you couldn't get these parts made in the U.S. because there was no factories here to make them. And so we were buying them overseas and we had an issue. And so this other supplier wanted to make a deal. We needed them to close the gap for us quickly. And they said, well, here's the price. It's $7 per part. But unless you, if you have a 3-year agreement with us, but if you don't, it's $50 per part. And so they took advantage of it. So we had to sign the 3-year agreement. But the thing is, come to that end of the 3-year agreement, we're not going to be buying parts from them. We're going to qualify somebody else over that 3-year period. So the end of that time came, they knew they took advantage of us. They knew that they were going to be in a position to lose that business. It was 20% of that factory that we moved that business to. But the thing is, come closer to that, then we had the leverage. Now they had the leverage. Yeah. Now we have the leverage.
That's what it is.
And so that's exactly what's happening here is we didn't have any leverage. I spent 3 years worth of spend in 6 months because we got taken advantage of. And then after a couple more years, then we had a better position. Then we had the leverage in negotiating. And so that's where we're at now is like, it's done. We have the leverage now. And now you can't look at these things in isolation. You have to look at all of them together to see this
and none of
strategy working out to realign things. Yeah.
One of the
right.
What was your point, Doug?
I was just saying none of that's a secret. It's like for your example that you're giving with the work thing is that both of you guys knew exactly where you stood. And so my point was that the communication, it might not be directly like, hey, I'm going to do this and then you're going to do that. It's more indirect communication of we know where we stand and none of this is going to be surprised when it finally unfolds.
And I have an example of it's dangerous if you don't know where you stand because you can really hurt yourself. Because I had an example of this purchasing manager. Well, this purchasing manager I knew at this company, he thought he had leverage over this supplier. And you know, we have tooling, or like the company had tooling that they buy and they put at the supplier they got to use to make their parts. And this manager said, you give me my parts right now and you take the other customer off and you do this or we're going to move all this business. And the next day, a truck showed up with that company's tooling and they said, we don't want your business. And so they got no parts. Instead of getting parts like a week or two later, they got no parts and they just destroyed the business because he didn't know his leverage. He didn't know what he was doing. And so that's a huge problem. He didn't stay in that job. I'll just say that. But.
Yeah.
Are you going to say, Troy?
Yeah, that's great. One of my favorite just leveraging points that Trump has made this last week was when he said the first countries that come to the table to make a deal, they're going to do really well. The last countries will not do well. And so this idea of like everybody rushing as fast as possible, like, okay, we want to get in there first, you know, so I was like, dang, that's pretty smart.
My last point on the reciprocal tariffs part before I switch the conversation up to the fun China conversation. But yeah, just to hit on what you guys are saying. Well, one, we've obviously seen an obscuring of the media to say that Trump is slapping tariffs on our allies and saying, hey, allies, you know, we have bad trade deals, slapping these tariffs. But a lot of times the legacy media that doesn't like Trump has not highlighted the extremely high tariffs that all these countries already have on us. And so to that point, I mean, that picture from earlier, there's a few countries that have as low as 10%. And this is like all of our trade people. There's a few that have as low as 10%. Some of our closest allies, some of our trade partners, they've been in the 30s, they've been in the 60s, some of them even up to 90%, 70 to 90% tariffs on us. And so EU is a perfect example of this. Like you were mentioning, Ryan, a lot of ways after World War II, we were kind of helping the rest of the world to get their economy going back. So the EU has had near 40%, the 39% tariffs on us. And so when Trump announced a 20% tariff on them, that's not even reciprocal. That's half of what they have. And when he announced a 20% tariff on EU, the media freaked out. The media was like, why are you doing this to our closest allies, Europe? You know, a lot of EU politicians did a lot of hooting and hollering and made a lot of noise. And we're like, oh, well, we're going to have reciprocal tariffs on you guys. We're going to retaliate. We're going to do what's best for us, which is hilarious sentiment because it's like, obviously, the U.S. is just we're trying to protect our own interests. But at the end of the day, very quickly, you see all that. When you guys were talking about leverage, you see all that noise kind of fizzles out. And then the countries started coming to the table and saying, okay, if we go down to 10%, will you go down to 10%? Or if we go down to 0, will you go down to 0? Very quickly starts happening because they don't have the leverage because they already have tariffs on us. That's the whole point, that these actually are reciprocal tariffs. And I'm more in favor of free trade as long as all the countries are friendly and good, which is a good segue into China. But if other of our allies and our good trading partners have really high tariffs on us, if we can negotiate and get those to come down, then it's going to be better for both of us. So let me switch over to what just happened yesterday and how this connects to China. So just yesterday, talking about the plan or the planned chaos, I think somebody said that earlier in this conversation. Just yesterday, Trump announced a 90-day pause on a lot of these tariffs and a lowering the tariffs to just 10%. And I saw that it was specifically for countries that did not retaliate against us. If somebody has more information on that than me, I didn't really like watch the head. I was just kind of
everybody but China. That's what that means. That's what that means.
Everybody except for everybody that was willing to work with us, which apparently was pretty much everybody. He's saying, all right, we're gonna lower these down to 10%. Which is good because that means that we are
good question,
other countries to lower down to probably at least that level. But the big announcement was that in the exact opposite vein, he announced a new 125% tariff on China effective immediately. And so that is the big question: is why has he lowered the tariffs on everybody else for the pause? And it did this pause, and then what is with the massive hike on China specifically? What do you guys think about that?
So we have a comment here from JM. I don't know if you can bring it up on the screen, but it says, any comments on trade imbalances being factored in? And so he says there's long-term issues and probably just thrown. So I think this is exactly where this is going with China. China has a $300 billion trade surplus, $300 billion. So 20% of China's GDP is from exports. So it's kind of a big deal that they have export businesses. So the U.S. is 14.8% of their exports. I think Japan is like 8%, and Europe is also around 15%. So it's a big deal. And so the thing is, though, China is, they're basically, the President Xi said that he's going to stand up to the U.S., stand up to America. And so now in negotiating with China, it's a lot about saving face and about how you look. And that's where Trump is really he's President Xi has put himself in a corner saying he's going to stand up to the U.S. And now he's got to make a decision on whether he's going to let his economy be hurt more and more and more, but it's not exactly 100% U.S. leverage, because we also have a lot of vulnerabilities for our companies here. I mean, we buy a lot of things like bicycles and things that have parts and long supply chains that originate in China. And so it's going to be interesting to see here, but it's going to be an all-out push to see who's going to win this. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch. But I think
it's already interesting to watch, especially the memes that are coming from it. They're cracking me up.
Troy, can you pull up that picture of Trump and Nancy Pelosi again? I just want to highlight this real fast before continue the conversation. So I thought this was absolutely incredible. I'm sure a lot of people have seen this, but the top picture is just from like a week ago. This is Trump coming out and defending his tariffs that he put in place on April 2nd. It actually lists a lot of the countries, but you see at the very top, it's really small. It says China, and it says 67%. And that is the estimate of essentially tariffs. And I think it also includes like currency manipulation. So essentially he's saying that is basically the tariff that China has against us, that they artificially raise our goods by 67% when they enter into China, which hurts our ability to sell things in China. And then he was saying, so what we're going to do is we're going to put a 34% tariff on them. So which is, about half. Now he's raised that a lot higher. But if you jump down to the bottom down there, that little picture, that is Nancy Pelosi from 1996. And she is literally doing the exact same thing in front of Congress. And she has a chart, but it's only about China. And you see that she's saying, hey, we have a 2% tariff against China. They have a 35% tariff against us. We have a 2% export rate into China. They have a 33% into us. And then she also lists the jobs that China has gotten, like 10 million jobs from selling to the United States. The United States only got 170 for selling to China. And this was back in 1996. Not in this speech. It's insane. I mean, she sounds exactly like Trump. She sounds exactly like Trump.
Yeah, but at some point somebody paid her.
Just to talk about the trade deficit.
Or it was her robot that finally took over and they got complete control of her now.
She talked about how China is doing like slave labor and how we should not have allowed them really to enter the World Trade Organization, because the World Trade Organization, because of Bill Clinton, allowed China to enter in the 1990s. And the idea was essentially that China was going to do better and not, become not a third world country anymore, would be advanced, and they would be like an ally. And it's only gotten worse and worse and worse. The IT theft, the near slave labor, the concentration camps, the genocides. We could go into all the spying of every country, hacking into our treasury. We could go into all the things that China does, which is really, really bad. But the point here is she was highlighting this awful trade deal that's hurting the United States and really helping China. And now Trump is saying literally the exact same thing, but it seems like the Democrats have forgotten that they used to care about this.
Yeah, Schumer said that too, didn't he? Wasn't Chuck Schumer another one? Like, they seem to go hand in hand all the time, Pelosi and Schumer. But I think I saw something on X about Chuck Schumer basically saying the exact same thing too, years ago. This is back.
Yeah, this is back when, if everybody tuned in last week, we had a chart that showed where voters are versus where politicians are now. And this is where the middle was a lot more the middle. It was not, people were negotiating the same outcome, the same ideas, and how to get there was really more of a discussion. And now it's gone into a very radically different ideas for how society should even be designed. And we don't even agree on the basic moral principles anymore. And so that's kind of where you see this
political
divergence.
Extremes and expectations have completely derailed common sense in a lot of ways in our society, unfortunately.
And emotional reaction.
As soon as Trump says something, it's bad, and we're all against it, even if it makes sense. It's just and it's been happening for decades. It's not just Trump. It's been happening.
If you look at, I want to mention this because your charts, you showed significant changes around early 2000s, I think, in 2008 or 2009. And let's see what happened there with regard to China. Now that we're talking about China. So in 2000, China was granted most favored nation status for trade. And in 2001, China was added to the World Trade Organization. And this was all done under the guise of, well, let's let them in and then they'll play nice and they'll be more like us and they'll get rid of their human rights abuses. And it's the exact opposite of what happened. They exported all these terrible things and communism. And like Reese, you talked about all of that. And what happened in 2009? Well, we saw with this crisis that happened. And in 2008, 2009, Germany was the world's #1 exporter, and China took over as the #1 exporter in 2009, and they have been the #1 ever since. And so what's happened is you see it used to be, I remember like when I was a kid back 30 some years ago, you would see made in China, and you just associated that with, well, that's cheap. It's just a cheap thing. Right. It's easily going to break, and you're going to need to replace it. And that's when they took over all the manufacturing of all these simple little trinkets and things. And now, I mean, you can actually iPhones are made in China and all these big high quality products. And so they really came along. And the thing is, they didn't adjust anything. Like you have to have a person, if you're going to do business in China, you have to have a joint venture. You can't open your own business. You have to have a joint venture with a Chinese national or a Chinese company, and you have to have a Chinese Communist Party member on the board of your company. And so that means they have access to everything, and you have to share. You have to share all the IP. Part. And then 2 or 3 years later, that company that you're doing a joint venture with doesn't need you anymore. So they say, never mind, but they've already got all your IP. And that is exactly how all of this happens. And then you have, like, I think Gates and all of them have this AI thing up in Beijing, and where they're training all these people there, or school for AI and all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, you had this partnering of our tech from the West and all that there. And so they're helping. There's, I think, 1 camera for every 2 citizens in China right now. And that's with AI, and they can tell who a person is by the stride of their walk, and wearing a mask. They can tell from their eyes. I mean, that's where it's going, but that's another soapbox.
Modern world domination looks a lot different than it used to, and this is a completely different kind of warfare, and that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
Is China's smart, and they figured out how to conquer from the inside out.
Yeah, and they have, and it's really crazy because in the last 20 years, to y'all's point, it's like the United States has kind of just rolled over and allowed them to do this because they haven't gone to physical war. Like usually we step in, like if they invade Taiwan or if they do this, they might, but they haven't gone to physical war. But they've been doing every other kind of warfare essentially on the world for the last 20 years, including what you just mentioned, stealing billions of dollars worth of IP. Intellectual property from the United States, and then turning around and then like trying to undercut American companies, pushing censorship on U.S. media companies and on the West in general to not be anti-Chinese. There's so many things that they've been doing, and I see some people in the comments, like essentially us doing trade with them it has been what has allowed them to build up their military industrial complex there in China. Which they have been ramping up to for the inevitable, potential possibility of war. So it is pretty crazy that it's just now. And again, it's seeing the Democrats in the 90s saying, hey, this is a problem. But then no one did anything about it. The last 20 years, so we're just like, well, hoping. Oh, the other thing too, China is the biggest polluter in the world. Biggest polluter in the world on every metric. No matter what it is that you're thinking about, they're the biggest polluter in the world of everything, and yet they've been allowed to sit on the United Nations and sit on even like environmental committees and stuff like that without the rest of the world saying, "Hold on a second,
they're building power plants.
You're not allowed to do this. You're a hypocrite."
Every day they're building coal-fired power plants. More dirty fire plants. Coal. The coal by itself doesn't have to be dirty, but you can do coal in a way that's more clean. They're not doing it in a way that's more clean.
Right. I want to highlight Steve Askew's comment. The urgent pause was all about the bond rates. That was something we talked about earlier, Steve, obviously, if you weren't there, but I mostly agree with you. I think that's a very fair point. But anyways, okay, I want to sorry to cut in. I want to talk about this graph that's up on the screen real fast. Impacts of China and free trade agreements on domestic manufacturing. So we're talking about all of the different negatives when it comes to dealing with China and allowing them into the World Trade Organization. And this is one of the negatives. So this is from an article titled, I'm on the wrong computer now. New manufacturing increasingly going to lower income towns. This is a good thing. This was written and published in February of 2024. So we've been talking about up to about 2022, because that's a lot of the data takes a few years to, really get out there and really become available and stuff. But this is looking at what's happened last year. And it's interesting because in this article, a lot of they're talking about how there's actually now a manufacturing boom occurring again. So this is since we saw that, that drop on that graph earlier. This is since then, just in the last couple of years. And they're swinging a lot of the credit to Trump's tariffs from his first term. And they're saying these tariffs that he implemented in his first term on things like steel and aluminum and China imports are actually now starting to affect the manufacturing boom again. And we're seeing some growth there back in the United States. But one of the interesting things in this article, they talk about the China shock, which is a phrase that academics have come up with to basically say this is what's happened to low income counties in the United States. So you see that graph there. Essentially, these are where the greater percentage of manufacturing jobs have been lost across the nation, specifically to China. And this is the interesting fact that the article points out. CPA analysis conducted in the fall of last year, that'd be 2023, finds that the trade deficit. Am I saying that right? Deficit. See, I am a homeschool. I'm a homeschool product, and this is my curse that I have to live with. No, I'm not gonna claim that.
Just getting fancy.
Yeah. With China, the deficit with China accounts for nearly half, or 47.9% of the manufacturing job loss. So China has stolen half of our manufacturing jobs. That's what they're trying to say. And so not only here's my point in all this, and it just wraps it back up to what y'all were saying. Not only are they stealing the jobs, you could look at that in different terms. Not only are they transplanting the jobs, whatever phrase you want to use, but they're doing a worse job of it. Like they're making they're in every way possible almost. They are doing the jobs that should be done here, but like y'all are saying, they're not doing it in a way that's taking people's lives into account, humanitarian aid, that kind of stuff. Yeah. It just like normal human beings living their lives in a way that they should be able to, like with freedoms that we have in the United States that China doesn't have. They're not taking into account the environment. They're not taking into account the way that they're, affecting all of these other nations around the world, especially low income nations. So the list goes on and on, but it's just crazy. I think it's crazy that we haven't responded to this as a nation sooner than now.
Well, right, and that's the reason I'm so excited about Trump's massive tariffs. I think we've had a conversation about tariffs before, and I remember saying, like, I would hope that most of our trade allies, we can negotiate with them and get to like a better trade agreement and more equal trade and lower tariffs. But ultimately, eventually, we can do that with most of our trade. And then I was like, one exception is China. Honestly, if we just cut China out, and that's like, this is my best case scenario that's occurring right now. It looks like Trump is pushing to isolate China, to say, all right, the rest of the world, you trade with us, we'll have fair trade agreements, but China, until you get your stuff together, you're going to be pushed out and your economy is going to suffer. And I'm glad someone is finally doing something about it. I know we're getting close to an hour mark, but you guys have some closing thoughts about China. We don't have to close right away, but think about how you want to finish this up.
Well, I'll just say, I think Trump. Sorry, I'll say this real quick, Ryan. I think Trump was betting on the world sentiment about China versus the United States. Right. Because some people are saying, well, everyone's just going to run to China. If you put these tariffs on, everyone's going to run to China. And it's like, no, that's not what we're seeing. And everyone's not running to China. They don't want to, for lack of a better term, be in bed with China. Sorry for that terminology, but it's like they don't want to be. It's like I got a picture earlier while we were talking about this of, you don't put your enemies, like if you have a room to rent, you don't rent that room to your enemies, because now they're in your house at night while you're sleeping. They're gonna take your stuff, or they're gonna, if it's like, depending on what they want to do, now they can kill you in your sleep or whatever. It's like depending on how bad of an enemy, but that's the thing. It's like, who do you want to be in your house with you? You're not going to put your enemies there, and I think China has made enough enemies around the globe that people are going to run to the United States before they run to China.
And I think. No, I was just going to say, I think that's exactly right. I think a lot of these countries are looking for a lifeline because they've seen how China operates with them, and they know that they get taken advantage of, and not in a good way. So I think that's a good point. A couple of closing comments. I do think what Pelosi talked about and what we saw that they couldn't get movement on this is just another example of politicians giving great speeches but not actually doing what they talk about. And so that makes for a great campaign video, and that's a whole other topic, a whole other issue to where you have a lot of speeches being given, but they're not actually doing things that come in alignment with that. Or there may be a little detail off in the bill that just kind of negates the entire bill. Like, for example, we can't have Chinese nationals buy farmland. Yeah, but a company, an LLC owned by a Chinese national can buy farmland. Like, that's kind of exactly what has happened. But one final comment, I think, I don't think that Trump taking these tariffs off, is a reaction to an unexpected sell-off of the bonds. And that is because this Stephen Moran, he's the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And this paper I've been talking about is called A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. And that was from November 2024. And it literally, they said the market volatility and bond sell-off is what will happen. And so what I would say is that it was anticipated and it was the design. So if you have a train coming through and all these decisions happening, and that is just one link in the chain. And so once that's done, okay, we did what we needed to do. We don't need the tariffs anymore. We got that restructure happening. And so for me, that was literally the design of this. And it came
right.
sooner
I
than
wasn't
think
saying,
a lot of people thought.
If you're pushing,
that was more of a comment. But that was for the comment from Steve, that he said that this was a reaction.
Right. And I agree.
Put up on the screen.
I agree with Steve, but I will say this, Ryan, my opinion is not that it was unexpected. Like my opinion is, I think that Trump is paying attention to these other factors, and there's at some point that he's weighing in. Now we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, and
it's just a decision tree.
The right timing to make that next decision, So I don't think it was unexpected either.
No, and it's just you see the response, and then you take the next step, and you see the response, and you take the next step. And I agree completely. That's exactly right. And so that's my kind of closing thoughts.
There's some balancing act that's happening. Like we're going to wait so long, but we're also going to take into this factor and not let this go dip too far.
Yeah, and I think I would just encourage people, as you look at these different things and headlines, you can't take any of these actions in isolation. You need to look at the total system of what's being happening and realize this is not just a little thing that is trying to be done. This is changing what has been happening for decades or over half a century, a new world trading system, global trading system. That's what's being attempted here. And it seems to be working. So it's going to be very interesting to see where this goes.
In closing thoughts, Doug?
I just wanted to speak to the like people side of this, the sentiment and the reaction and all that. I think that it would be good if we as a country could sort of relearn to have more longer term vision. Right now, we're also short-sighted and it's due to the attention deficit that we have that has been developed by the media that we all consume daily. If we don't get our news within 5 seconds, or we don't see what we want to see as we scroll by within 0.5 seconds, then we're moving on with life. And so the reaction to the market and to the tariffs and all that is extreme because people are just so short-sighted, and we need to kind of take a step back and maybe go take a walk out in nature or something, like we gotta reevaluate how we react to this, because our reactions, especially now that it is easier than ever to be invested into the market in general, you got, things like Robinhood makes it super easy to be invested. It causes a chain reaction because now we have more people invested who aren't big time investors, just the average retail person who's now reacting to the market emotionally because they're short-sighted. And we've got to take our emotions and set them aside, look at it logically, take the bigger view, step back, and really think about how we want to react and respond to this. And we have been spoiled as a country in that we have never had our hands slapped for reacting too quickly, or at least not well enough. And it's just, we got to really take a step back and reevaluate, but I don't know if we will or not. And hopefully these changes and people seeing them, and hopefully they're good changes, and I think they will encourage people to think more long-term rather than short-term.
Yeah, I agree. And one quick thing, and then I'll let you go, Reese, to go along with what you're saying, Doug, I titled this live stream, "No, Trump Didn't Break the Stock Market," because I saw a video that went viral, had millions of views, that said Trump just broke the stock market, and all the red lines going down. And so we have to take into consideration when we're reacting, like you said, emotionally to things, or choosing not to react emotionally, that people are making money off of selling information nowadays more than anything else, and more than ever before. And so somebody posting a video the day after the stock market drops or the day of saying Trump broke the stock market, that person made a whole lot of money off of everybody clicking on that and watching that out of fear, but they didn't make, that doesn't mean just because the video did well, that doesn't mean, and they made money off it, does not mean that they did their research or that their facts are founded on anything real. It could just be hype and emotionalism, and they don't care if they were right or not. They don't care if they lost subscribers or not, whatever, or they lost trust or whatever, because they made a bunch of money, so like that's the problem with the information drive, is that a lot of it is hype, and a lot of it is, let's go to the extreme because we know that's what's going to get the clicks and views, and so we're trying to push back on this channel a little bit against that, and we're trying to have a balanced conversation about some of these things. And that's the reason why, is because I believe we need more of that in the world that we live in.
Absolutely. I was going to agree with all of y'all. I love the long-term perspective that y'all have highlighted, and just bringing back that kind of Wall Street, Main Street analogy that, like, last decades, maybe even the last 100 years, there's been a shift of balance away from being able to have a healthy Main Street economy in the United States to moving over to a Wall Street economy and then a global trade economy that unfortunately has helped other countries instead of the United States mainly. And so the long-term perspective on this, although it can be really complicated, and you don't have to believe that Trump knows everything that he's doing or that his advisors are like always making the right decisions, but it's good to take a step back and have a long-term perspective to say, oh, wait, the world has been moving in this direction for the longest time, and there's reasons why it needs to get rebalanced and put back into a different direction. And there's going to be some shaking, obviously, that occurs with those things. You have one last point, Ryan?
Yeah, one last thing here. I wanted to say that I saw an article from the Wall Street Journal that talked about how the big bank administration, the big banks have not had a substantial meeting with Trump since 2020. And so this is going from, instead of having the market and economy and global economy benefiting a small financial elite interest, it is, and hollowing out the domestic industrial capacity and employment in the U.S. This is restructuring it to bring it back to where we have that security here in the U.S. and that industrial manufacturing base. And so I think it's interesting that these big banks don't have the sway like they did on previous administrations. And so that's just another point to what you're saying, is it's the long-term interest, because you can only go so long without making anything in the country. And then all of a sudden, all these other trade deals get made in the background. They can all turn off the faucet at the same time. And so I think it's good that you close talking about the long-term interest. And I think we always got to consider those short-term, medium-term, and long-term, and including all people groups and everything there as well.
Love it. Love it. Well, this is a fun conversation, guys. Thank you, everyone who's commented and tuned in, and y'all have a great day.
Yeah, one quick thing before we jump off. If you're watching live and you haven't seen the recent video, we posted 2 interesting videos this week. One is jailing conservatives, talking about Le Pen and the far right leader being potentially jailed in France. Another video is talking about what Trump may potentially be doing in the Congo and with the mineral deal that could potentially be happening there, and the letter written to Trump from the president of Congo. So y'all go check out those videos, recent videos on Filibustered. Also, if you're not subscribed, make sure you subscribe. And don't forget, there are long format, extended, exclusive conversations available both on locals.com and now on YouTube as well. You can, for a small monthly fee, you can become a YouTube member on the channel or a Locals member and get access to the exclusive content. Also, we're posting the uncut conversation. Sometimes we'll post shorter videos on YouTube, but the full-length uncut conversation is going to be available to members only. So if y'all want to sign up for that. There's my plug. We didn't do that at the beginning, but that's okay. So peace out.
Yeah.